Let's get started with Putin's condition for a political settlement or a peace plan. He pointed out two critical elements. One of them was to the Ukrainians. He was talking about the Ukrainian army withdrawing all troops from Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions. And on the other hand, he wanted Kiev to issue a declaration of refusal of NATO aspirations. Right now, we had these conditions of Putin before the summit in Switzerland. Right after we had the summit in Switzerland, Ukrainian government wants to control the Zaporizhia power plant. And this is totally in contradiction with what Putin was asking for. Is this an opportunity for Ukrainians and NATO to go after some sort of political settlement?
Well, I'm not sure. And honestly, even though Vladimir Putin, in his speech to a board of officials of the foreign ministry on Friday, he mentioned the word proposal. But honestly, I'm not sure it was a proposal. I think this idea was probably not to disrupt, but probably to throw a stone in the water in the conference in Bergenstock. The reason is that everybody understood that this so-called peace conference was not a peace conference at all. It was not designed to negotiate or to find a possible way to solve the crisis, but it was just a way, in fact, to legitimize, I would say, Zelensky, not even his 10 points plan, because if we go back to his plan, he mentioned, I think I mentioned that on this channel. His plan was, and we can remind you here, he came up with a 10-point plan. But if we look at the 10 points, we note that these points are all coming out of UN resolution that have been adopted by the General Assembly, mostly the General Assembly, in fact, since February 2022. And so if we look at these, they are exclusively measures proposed by the General Assembly. As a result, for instance, when we talk about Zaporozhye, that's the first point, radiation and nuclear safety. And I have all these paragraph and reference, by the way, are on the official document established by Zelensky presidential office when he presented first his plan in November 2022. So all these references, and notably Zaporozhye, was a measure that was taken by the General Assembly in order to preserve the integrity of the nuclear power plant at a time when the West accused Russia to attack this nuclear power plant. As of today, we know that Russia never attacked and never shelled this nuclear power plant because, in fact, it was under its control since March 2022. So there was no point to shell something that you have under control. But in fact, it is something, and we know because it was confessed by the head of the Ukrainian military intelligence, the GUR, Kirilo Budanov. He confessed that it was the Ukrainians who used to shell this Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. So we see that the whole setting and all the reference that we have in these 10 points plan or formula are basically irrelevant. And if I indicated last time we had this conference that there might be 3 points that would be kept by for the conference, and these are the 3 points. And if you read the final communique of the conference, you will see that what I presented here in your channel, in fact, is confirmed. These are the 3 points that were kept by the participants of the conference. The interesting thing is that the 3 points that are mentioned here are, in fact, very benign in substance, because everybody agrees with nuclear safety, with food security, and the release of prisoners. So there is nothing very contentious on that. And you can see that this conference was not about finding a settlement, but it was, in fact, just about confirming the authority of Zelensky. I remind you that Zelensky is no longer, in fact, a legitimate, or at least legal, he has no longer a legal tenure because his mandate has expired. And since he revoked the presidential election, then he is not legitimate to answer. So we see that this conference aimed at nothing. And that's probably the reason why Vladimir Putin decided last Friday to come up with something saying, guys, you are completely besides the point. And if anything you might discuss during the conference will be totally besides what we expect from a solution of the conflict. And these are the conditions that we set for the resolution of the conflict. And in fact, Putin is totally right, because the tactical and operational situation right now in Ukraine is such that those who have the upper hand are the Russians. So the idea of having this conference without the Russians doesn't make any sense at all. And that's what Vladimir Putin wanted to present. So even if he used the word proposal, I don't see that as a proposal, but more as let's say that these are my conditions, period. When you make a proposal, you answer, you can expect a counter offer or another response. But here he explains, and I think that was also explained by several Russian politicians on Friday, that they don't expect any answer to that. They don't expect a counter proposal, because these are the conditions, period. So it's not an offer in that sense. These are the conditions, period. So whatever you discuss will be besides the point. That I think is the message behind the proposal. Now, if we go deeper into the proposal, let's take the second part of your question, the question of Ukraine renouncing to be part of NATO and, in fact, becoming a neutral nation to some extent, with security guarantees offered by certain countries, but basically, essentially, a neutral nation. Now, here are 2 points that needs to be considered. The first one is that if you look at the Ukrainian constitution of 1991, it provided, although the word neutrality is not mentioned in the constitution, it provided a context, a national security context for Ukraine that is very similar to a neutral state. And probably that's, or maybe you could argue it's closer to the status of Finland, for instance, but that was what was in the Ukrainian constitution in 1991. And what Putin is proposing, in fact, is to revert to that situation that you had in the early constitution of Ukraine as it became independent. So that's the first point. The second point is, and I think Putin has a very valid point here, is that in March 2022, we have mentioned that also on this channel, that you remember that after in mid-March 2022, Zelensky made a proposal to the Russians to solve the crisis and basically to find a peace situation. And in that proposal of Zelensky, there was the idea that Ukraine would not join NATO, and that Ukraine would de facto become neutral, as it was in the Constitution of 1991, by the way, and the neutrality of Ukraine would be guaranteed by a certain number of countries, among which you had Russia. So, in fact, and that is in fact what Putin says in his address to these foreign ministry officials. He said basically that shouldn't be a problem since Ukraine already accepted that. This is a context that even Ukraine itself proposed 2 years ago. So, and Russia agreed on these terms. It was because of the influence of Western countries, European Union generally speaking, but more specifically Boris Johnson, and Germany and France, who came and in fact disrupted the negotiation and proposed to Zelensky to withdraw his proposal in exchange of a help, financial and military supply for as long as it takes. So in March 2022 or early April 2022, Zelensky traded peace against a support from the West for as long as it takes. And so Putin comes back to that situation. He said, well, you proposed that to us 2 years ago, so there is no reason why you should already be against the same situation. So that's my proposal. But of course, the situation has changed. And then we come to the first part of your question, because in March 2022, Russia, Vladimir Putin basically, but the Russian negotiators were ready to withdraw all Russian troops from Ukraine, leaving the question of the two Republic of Donbass, Donetsk and Lugansk, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the question of Crimea to be discussed at a later stage. But in essence, the idea was that Russia would withdraw all its troops from Ukraine, and Russia was ready to do so. But all that was changed and disrupted by the intervention of Boris Johnson, as I just explained. So the Russians said, you accepted to be neutral, so we agree, we bring that on the table right now. But on the other hand, as we proposed or we accepted to withdraw all of troops from Ukraine, you refused the deal. So there is no point for us to go back to that deal. I mean, since we have the upper hand, there's no reason for us to come back to a situation which is disfavorable. I mean, you took the risk to renounce to the proposal, and now I think there is no way at this stage, at least, as I can feel it from the Russian side, that they would revert to the conditions that were proposed by Zelensky in March 2022. So so it's not an Istanbul 2, as some people have suggested, because the Russians now they've spent so much lives to get these territories. The Ukrainians didn't want to accept the withdrawal of your Russian troops. So, okay, you passed your chance. Now we are in a new situation. So this is an interesting proposal on that aspect, because what might surprise people today that this neutrality of Ukraine and all that might surprise people, but at the same time, Ukrainians themselves proposed that 2 years ago. And that's interesting because I haven't seen the article, but apparently the New York Times has published the text of the agreement that was about to be agreed upon by both sides in March 2022 or April 2022. So it's an interesting publication. I mean, the time, the point in time where it's published is interesting because it comes exactly at the time where we had this kind of a pseudo peace conference in Switzerland, and at the time when you have this Russian proposal by Vladimir Putin. It's interesting when I said that Putin wanted to disrupt the Swiss conference. Apparently, it seems that Putin decided to have this this address on Friday at on very short notice. Apparently, it was not planned, and even the people attending to this meeting were surprised because nobody planned this. It came on a very, very short notice. So that's why I think Putin tried to play a coup against the Swiss conference. And just to underline the fact that this conference was totally misplaced and misguided, in fact. And even in Switzerland, I mean, if I go not in the mainstream media, who of course are very happy and find this conference very successful, but if you go to people who are aware of the diplomatic and political habits in Switzerland and in Europe, all of them consider this conference as a terrible failure, even a disaster for Ukraine, but also a disaster for Switzerland, and a disaster for the West as well, because this conference, in fact, undermines the credibility of the West, and probably not just in the West itself, but in the whole world. Note that before the conference, the Swiss government extended the invitation to 160 countries, probably with the help of the Ukrainian Zelensky office. I don't know exactly what was the work sharing between the two, because apparently the Ukrainians had a very strong influence on the way the Swiss had to organize and manage this conference. But anyway, you had 160 invitations extended to world countries, and only 100 delegations showed up to that conference, among which you had, and remember that this conference was supposed to be a summit, meaning that in essence you had to have the head of states, basically. And that was the idea, because again, I come back to the real objective of this conference was not to find a way towards peace. It was, in fact, to confirm the legitimacy of Zelensky. That was the reason of that conference, at least as viewed from Kiev. The Swiss might have some illusions, but the very idea was to confirm the legitimacy of Zelensky. So that's why the idea of a summit was there. But out of the 160 countries that were invited, only 57 head of states showed up. So it's a third of all the countries invited. You had 30 ministerial delegation and 5 delegation by anybody. I mean, even New Zealand sent this minister of corrections to the summit. So that shows that from the point of view of the rest of the world, this was just a show. It was very much, this conference, in fact, has nothing to do with peace. It had to do with PR. It was a PR operation for Zelensky. And probably not a good one, because even the final communique that was issued by the at the end of the conference was signed only by 78 countries, plus 3 non-countries organizations like the European Council and all that. So you had basically 78 countries that signed on this final communique. And the final communique, as I showed before, was based on resolution that the countries have already accepted in the General Assembly of the United Nations. So in essence, those who have signed, and that's probably the reason why you have Turkey and countries like that who have signed the final communique. In fact, they didn't sign for anything else than something they had already signed for in the General Assembly of the United Nations. So basically, the communique, the output or the outcome of this conference was nothing else than something that all countries have already agreed upon. But it was absolutely nothing new. It didn't even create a kind of a dynamics towards peace or something, or ways to address peace in Ukraine, or a new strategy to engage the Russians, or whatever. It was just the 3 points that I mentioned that have already been agreed upon by all member states of the UN. And the communique just took those points, and in fact, that was based on 2 resolutions of the General Assembly. I mean, 3 points based on 2 resolutions of the General Assembly. And if you read the final communique of the Swiss Department of Foreign Affairs, they recall those 2 resolutions. So absolutely nothing new in terms of outcome. And if not even all the participants have signed the final communique. Even the Holy See, who was observer into the conference, didn't sign the final communique. So it shows that we have here only a PR exercise that, in my view, is not in favor of what the West is trying to portray as a global. I mean, the idea was to address the problem of peace globally. It didn't manage that. It was, at the end of the day, again, all the same partners in crime who came about in this conference. So this was, in my view, a total failure of the Western diplomacy and the Swiss diplomacy in particular. So nothing to be proud about, in my view. And not just that, but that's not something that will help to move ahead. It doesn't provide any step to move ahead, or to go towards a better solution, or to open ways of addressing the issue, the Ukraine crisis. So, in fact, if you consider all that, coming back to your question of Vladimir Putin, the only new information we got in the last days was, in fact, what Vladimir Putin said, because that was that we could have expected that, but it was not officially known. So now we know exactly what are the conditions that the Russians expect for this having a settlement of that crisis, and that's a starting point, because the 10 points of the peace formula of Zelensky, these were points that were presented. That was the 7th time that these points were presented to nations. And all these conferences have been failures. And again, they don't set anything new in terms of possible solution. Now, at least, regardless of what we may think about Vladimir Putin and the Russian view, that's not the point here. But at least we know what they want. We know what the conditions are. We know what we have something to start a discussion with. And I think that's the merit of Vladimir Putin's I use his word proposal, but conditions, because that's the starting point. And now we know where to start with if we want to discuss something, because we know that's the baseline that has been set by Vladimir Putin. The 10 points of the peace formula are no longer, I mean, I just mentioned the case of Zaporozhye just to show that this resolution was adopted in summer 2022, and it's outdated because it addresses a problem that has never been a problem, really. I mean, the problem of Zaporozhye was in fact Ukrainian army shelling the nuclear power plant, not the Russians. So meaning that these 10 points are completely outdated. So they cannot be a solid base for further discussions. And that, in addition to that, as I explained before, even for Zaporozhye, even the Ukrainians themselves have confessed that they were the ones shelling the nuclear power plant. So this is the snake biting its own tail, and therefore this conference, in my view, brings absolutely nothing in the discussion, nothing new at least. And therefore the Putin's comment, maybe that's a reason why he did this kind of emergency meeting in Moscow to present his conditions to the peace settlement, because that could have helped the participants of the conference to address the question of a possible settlement, and maybe to identify some ways of addressing the problem given what Putin just said. But nobody took that opportunity. And in fact, once again, the West is completely overtaken by the events. So we are behind history, so to say. So it's a little bit tragic.
We had a former Ukrainian politician, Viktor Medvedchuk. He was suggesting that the Putin's peace initiative is the last chance to preserve the Ukrainian state. And we know that Putin said, beyond these two conditions that he put out, he said that these conditions are so fluid that they're going to change as time goes by in this conflict. And do you think at the end of the day, are we going to have Ukraine being totally destroyed and losing its statehood in this war between NATO and Russia?
Absolutely. And I think the Russians have already indicated that. The thing is, and you have the book behind me here, The Russian Art of War. In the Russian Art of War, you set objectives for your military campaign or your operations and so on and so forth. But these objectives are not cast in stone, meaning that they evolve with the situation and they have to be adjusted. Remember that the Russians, in military terms, think like Clausewitz, and that the war is the continuation of politics with other means, meaning that there's always a bidirectional relationship between military operations and politics, and mostly foreign policy. And and that's the way the Russians work. And that's the reason why, for instance, if I come back to that, because that was also mentioned by Vladimir Putin in his address, by the way. When you hear the address, Vladimir Putin's address on the 24th of February 2022, he said that the two objectives of the military operation was the demilitarization and the denazification of the threat against the population of Donbass. And since February 2022, obviously Russian forces have advanced deeper into Ukraine, and the two essential aim of the objective, demilitarization, denazification, remain, but they're no longer about the threat against the population of Donbass, but they are about Ukraine. So it's the same objective that has been adjusted to the strategic situation. And that illustrates exactly the way the Russians think. Now, if you push this reasoning to the extreme, you would say that this could lead to the end position, the end of the Ukrainian state. And that's why you have this very strange behavior of the West, because knowing the way the Russians wage war, the way they think war, the way they understand this relationship between foreign policy and war, they still keep providing weapons to Ukraine, knowing that regardless of the number of weapons we provide to Ukraine, Ukraine will not be in such a position to reverse the situation. So we know that the situation can only worsen for Ukraine, because regardless of how many F-16 we provide, regardless of how many Bradley or how many Leopard 2 tanks we provide to Ukraine, this will not change the equation, for the simple reason that everything we have provided so far has been systematically destroyed. And the more time goes on, the more we see that the Russians learn from the experience, and they learn the lessons, and they improve their abilities. We see that now they know exactly how to cope with anti-air defense missiles, Patriot, and so on. And now these systems are no longer effective against Russian weapons. So the Russians are improving. And on the Ukrainian side, you have almost the opposite, because the equipment we can provide, I mean, the West can provide to Ukraine, is less and less performing, because we don't have anymore any capacity to provide Ukraine with effective equipment. And had we such equipment, it would take so much time to train Ukrainian personnel to use this equipment that they would probably not reach the battlefield soon enough to cope with the situation. As a result, we are the Ukrainians are almost condemned to use obsolete equipment that doesn't work. I remind you that even Zelensky complained that most of the equipment he received from the West was not working properly, that the training provided by NATO countries to Ukrainian soldiers was inadequate, was not tailored for the kind of warfare that is waged in Ukraine, because NATO countries have waged war in Afghanistan, Iraq, or wherever in the world, and these are definitely not the same conditions as the one the Ukrainians are facing in Ukraine, on a Ukrainian battlefield. As a result, even the training is not adequate. The French, for instance, are coming up with providing Mirage 2000-5 fighters, in addition to the F-16 fighters. Now, we had 1 year ago the head, or it was the spokesperson of the Ukrainian Air Force, if I'm not wrong, General Ignat, who said, because at the time it was already 1 year ago, the French also mentioned this the possibility of providing Mirage 2000-5. And at that time, Ignat said, well, if the French give us the Mirage 2000, that will be an additional burden to us, because that will just only complicate our logistics and complicate the training of our pilots. So it's not a help, it will be an additional burden. But what happens today? Macron just offered this Mirage. So we see that we are not helping the Ukrainians. We are just helping ourselves to cope with a situation that we are not able to address differently than just by providing weapons. And by providing these weapons, we are simply increasing the difficulties of the Ukrainians. So, and we see, by the way, with the F-16, we see all the problem of using them. And you had these scheme of for using them, that you would you have these F-16 stored in NATO countries and then moved to some Ukrainian airfields in order to be then armed and equipped for combat missions against Russia. So it's an extremely complex scheme that push the Russians closer to a direct encounter with NATO countries. So we see that even our solutions are not really workable, and we are complicating the life of Ukrainians. We are just making the life of the Ukrainians more difficult, because the Russians, again, I repeat, because nobody seems to understand that, but the problem when you make war, the problem is not the number of weapons you have. The problem is how you can integrate these weapons into a consistent strategy and doctrine in order to fight. That's why it's not even the quality of the weapon which is important. It's the way you integrate that into your doctrine. That's the reason why the Palestinians are have so much success against the Israeli, although their weapons are certainly less performing and probably less advanced than the one of the Israelis. But the difference is that they use their weapons in a context, a strategic context, that they know exactly all the whereabouts. They have the adequate doctrine to use them. They have the adequate structure to use them. They have the adequate command and control structures to use them. And that makes the difference. While the Israeli army, despite overwhelming superiority in terms of weapons, have weapons that are not designed for this kind of fighting in Gaza. There are weapons designed to fight a conventional war against Syria or Egypt or whoever, but not a counterinsurgency war in Gaza. And that's exactly what I'm saying. And the same happens in Ukraine. The Russians have, and they have even improved in the last 2 years, to integrate their weapons, including the drones and all that. Everything is integrated to a single command and control structure, integrated into the structure of the combat troops, and so on and so forth. While on the Ukrainian side, they have so different weapons coming from different countries with different capabilities, with different logistics and all that. They are not able to put all these weapons into a consistent approach to warfare. And that's the reason why, despite the courage, despite the bravery of the Ukrainian soldiers, they will not be able to have the upper hand, just because structurally what the West has provided to them doesn't allow for a consistent approach of the battlefield and the command and control on the battlefield, and that's the whole issue. So I don't understand the European, not just the politicians, but also the military people who advise the leaders in Europe, that they don't understand that. It's not about the number of pieces of artillery you have. It's not that. It's how quick you can integrate these artillery pieces into a command and control structure. See the drones. The Ukrainians have been very innovative at the beginning of the conflict, using all the small drones and even adapting commercial drones for combat purposes or reconnaissance and all that. The problem is that all these drones are probably nice and effective if you take every single individual drone. But as long as this drone cannot be integrated into an operational concept that use this drone in combination with artillery, with reconnaissance, with command and control and all that, this will lead nowhere. And that's exactly the problem we have. So by providing weapons to Ukraine, we are not only create additional problems for the Ukrainian military, but in fact, we are pushing Ukraine towards destruction, because the Russian side, on the other hand, is able to destroy that, and they will do it. Remember what General Surovikin said in October 2022? He said, we are not planning to make big operations. Now what we are doing is waiting for the enemy that attacks us, and will destroy it systematically. And that's what they are doing. And that's why you have all today all these what you can see in the streets of the large cities in Ukraine, people from the mobilization recruitment office chasing young males on the street, arresting them and forcing them into for the battlefield. These guys will be forced to go on the battlefield, will be forced to fight. They will certainly not fight with all the energy and the enthusiastic approach that they probably had 2 years ago. But today, most of the people understand that the cause is lost. A recent poll provided by the Kiev International Institute for Sociology shows that for more than 50% of the population in Ukraine, they acknowledge that Zelensky has not fulfilled his promises. So, the trust into the leadership is missing. They understand, because they know that the situation through internet and all that, so they know that the situation is not as good, despite propaganda and official communication and PR operations and all that. They know that the situation is not good, and even the soldiers themselves have said that, even in the official media and in the Western mainstream media. But it's also interesting to see that what you didn't have probably 1 year ago or so, today you have Ukrainian media, such as the Kyiv Independent, Kyiv Post, New Voice of Ukraine, and all that, who are reporting articles from the West suggesting that the situation for Ukraine is desperate. So people in Ukraine are more and more aware of the real situation, and therefore the willingness to fight is no longer here. And the problem is that the narrative, the Western narrative that press Ukrainians to fight and say there is no discussion, no possible discussion with Vladimir Putin, that just that goes against the interests of Ukraine. So Medvedchuk is totally right. By the way, I mentioned this Western narrative against any kind of discussion. It's also interesting that in his speech, Vladimir Putin mentions the fact that the first condition to have a settlement, and the reason why there will be no discussion at this stage between Russia and Ukraine, is that because Ukraine has even, or Zelensky has even published a decree prohibiting to have any discussion with Vladimir Putin or with Russia as long as Vladimir Putin is in office. So this law is in effect, is in force. As a result, regardless of the situation, regardless of a politician in Ukraine would like to discuss or with Russia, regardless of all that, the law prevents anyone in Ukraine to have peace discussions with Russia as long as Vladimir Putin is in office. So we see that we are in a situation, that's also the reason why, by the way, we are coming back to the conference in Bürgenstock in Switzerland, because again, even if Russia would have been invited to this summit, there would be no discussion, because again, Zelensky was not able, or was not in a capacity to negotiate by law. So this conference was doomed to fail just by the legal framework in which it happened. And that's exactly what Vladimir Putin said. He said, well, if you want to talk, we're ready to discuss, to talk and to negotiate. But the first thing you have is first in your camp, in your area, start to have the right legal basis for that. And that's the total contradiction we have. We have a peace conference, knowing that regardless of what happens, regardless of what would be the proposal of Vladimir Putin or whoever, there will be no discussion because Ukrainians are not able to discuss. So again, we are exactly what I said before. The snake is biting its tail. And that's the situation in which the West, in fact, has pushed Ukraine into. And in my view, we are going towards the destruction of Ukraine, because if you look at the problem from the Russian side, if you put the Russian shoes and boots, and you look at the crisis from Moscow, what do you see? You see the West that is pouring weapons on the Ukrainian battlefield, that Ukraine is struggling to find combatants for fighting against Russia, that you are the winner, and there is no hope or no indication that the West would change its policy. So if you are in this position, you say, well, the only logical solution to that situation is the total destruction of Ukraine. Because since they are not allowed to negotiate, since the West doesn't want them to negotiate, since the West is providing weapons to encourage Ukrainians to fight, and if Ukrainians had the slightest opportunity to have a victory, you could understand that the war could continue, because then you would have probably a slight chance that you might have a victory. But as we have mentioned that on your channel already once, even the West doesn't know is not able to define what could be a victory for Ukraine. They're not able to understand, to outline what could be considered as a victory. And as we see things developing on the battlefield, we see that there is absolutely no sign of any option for victory coming up. There is no advance on the Ukraine side at all. There is no point on the front line where Ukraine has any advantage or any option for success. As a result, everything you do on the Western side to continue the war, in fact, you are just feeding the ability of the Russians to destroy Ukraine. That's the only position. So Medvedchuk is in that sense perfectly right. But I think if you take a little bit distance with the whole crisis, you would see that and we have already mentioned that, by the way, if you look at what's happening in the rest of the world and in Russia in particular, but also in China, you would say that on this rest of the world side, you have people who have a much more educated, strategic understanding of the situation than in the West. In the West, you have basically tacticians, people who are able to address the problems at tactical level, both at political, on the political dimension or military or whatever, even in domestic politics, by the way. If you look at what's happening in France today, this is just tactics. These people have absolutely no understanding with the big picture. They're always they see the tree, but they don't see the forest. And that's exactly what characterizes the leadership in Europe and in the West, basically, in generally speaking. They see the trees, but they don't see the forest. As a result, they don't have the necessary distance you may have. As I always said, if you are on the battlefield, if you're a soldier, if you are Ukrainian, you fight for your country and you do it rightly. If you are Russian, you fight for your country and you do it rightly as well. I mean, on both sides, I understand that. And that's just to do so. And I understand the Ukrainians who have in mind that they must repel the Russians. I understand that. And if I were Ukrainian, I would probably do the same. But now I'm not Ukrainian, I'm Swiss, meaning that I'm outside of the theater of war. I can observe the theater of war from a distance. I'm not supposed to look at the trees, but to look at the forest. And from that point of view, I'm standing on top of the hill, or as who was this the famous actor in the Dead Poet Society? Who was the professor? The name is Keating. He's standing on a desk. You may remember this picture. He's standing on the desk to look at and no Western leader is able to stand on the desk, to stand on the hill and look at the big picture. And we need people today who are able to stand on the desk, to think differently, to stand up, look at the crisis from a distance, trying to understand the whereabouts, and not just to satisfy each other ambition and things like this. But that's what we have, unfortunately. We have only these kind of leaders in the West. I think on the Eastern side, and you have that in China, you have that in Iran, you have that in, we can say that about Iran. I think you're from Iranian extraction or something like that. I may be wrong, but I think so. But we saw that in the way Iran responded to the Israeli attack in Damascus. We see that these guys didn't look at the tree, they look at the forest. And for that reason, they had to respond, but they did it in a way that that is a strategic understanding of the problem. And that's where you can see that in the Asian part of the world, I can say, because now we can put Russia into this Eurasian part, and China, Iran, I mentioned that. But this is this ability of understanding the problem from a holistic point of view, to understand what may happen if I do this or that. And you take your decision knowing the whereabouts of the consequences of what you're doing. When we look at what the Western leaders are doing, you feel that they have absolutely not even the ability to understand the consequences of their decisions. And we see that with the sanctions. I mean, I think there was a document that was published, an article published very recently, probably yesterday or so, showing that now Russia has surpassed the US in providing liquid natural gas to Europe. So you have these guys having declaration about against feeding the Russia and all that, and sanctions and all that. And at the end of the day, it's still Russia that provides them with liquid natural gas. So we see that these guys has absolutely no understanding of what's going on. Nothing, zero. They have the IQ of a shoebox, literally. I mean, this is dramatic, and I'm sitting now in Brussels, which is the capital of Europe. It's desperate to see that, to see how intellectually challenged we are in dealing with those crises. The same happens to Palestine and all that. I mean, all these crises, we have absolutely no understanding of the consequences. We see just the immediate thing. So we strike, we destroy, and we're happy of the destruction. And later we have a terrorist attacking us and we are just surprised. No, if you don't want terrorists, you don't start going bombing people. That's the first step of a counter-terrorist strategy, is stopping going bombing people. That's the first step. Then you can have, but it's not the way we do it. We bomb people, they are not happy, and they come to bring bombs in our countries, and so we develop surveillance methods, and we have to have surveillance of cell phone communication and everything, and facial recognition and all that, but all that could be prevented by just avoiding bombing people in their own country. This is, if you look at all the way the West is looking at is managing this crisis, it's amazing that nobody has realized that we could live in a much better world if we could, instead of spending money on bombs we deliver on Iraq, Syria, and wherever in the world, we need money to have nice roads, high-speed trains, and I don't know what, but it's not what we are doing. So it's just incredible. And in fact, we are digressing a little bit because we are far away from Ukraine, but in fact it's the same issue. It's the same issue because it's a total inability to understand the problems, to have a hierarchy and prioritizing a hierarchy of problems, I mean, and prioritizing the problems and having strategies. We don't have strategies. We are just acting tactically. We have a problem, it's hip shooting each time, and there is no real thoroughly thought strategy to address a wide range of problems, and that no, we are not doing that. And that's what I think the rest, what we call the rest of the world, which is not a very polite description, but let's use it. But the rest of the world is understanding that the West is acting in a very childish way. By children, I mean, Annalena Baerbock was a trampolino athlete. Yermak was a film producer. Zelensky was an actor. Trudeau was a art drama teacher. Macron knew his wife as a drama student. You know, we have just these kind of people. I mean, these are they're just doing PR. They're just showing things. It's a show. It's not thoroughly thought. And you know, you could see that you had people like this, like Ronald Reagan in the 80s, who were also an actor, but with this actor, you had other people like Kissinger and other people who had this ability to understand the strategic context, to understand the situation, and to advise the president. And the president was not just for the show. He listened. He knew that he didn't know. And with that in mind, he listened to his advisors. And that's why they were more successful. I'm not saying they always made good decisions, but they were definitely more successful than the leaders we have today. They only listen to themselves. They are hedonistic, egocentric, stupid, and they have absolutely no ability to understand problems in a holistic way. As a result, they're not able to design strategies, they're not able to stick to a strategy, and they act, as I said, on a hip shooting basis. On every day is a new answer to the problem. And even Macron, he said A one day, B the other day, and C the third day, and then he comes back to A, B, and C. So it's changing all the time. So how can you elaborate any strategy with people who change their mind every single day? This is totally inconsistent. But that's exactly the way the Western countries are led. I mean, when you hear Mrs. von der Leyen talking about chips taken from wash machines to put into missiles, I mean, everybody knew that it was just bullshit, but they keep repeating that. You know, this is just amazing how these people become impregnated from with their narrative, and starts repeating this narrative, even if they know that, I mean, everybody knows that it's totally inconsistent and even not true. So as a result, you base decisions on a narrative and not on the reality.